Husband presumed dead reappears, but his wife already has another husband. Elizabeth never thought a single piece of paper could destroy her world. Yet there she stood, in the middle of the drawing room, clutching an official letter from the army, its royal seal sealing her fate with cold indifference. Her heart raced, a strange mix of hope and dread. Maybe it's a message from Thomas, she dared to think. But deep down, she already knew that good news never came in envelopes like this. As her eyes swept over the formal handwriting, the truth hit her like a blow. Thomas, her Thomas, had been declared dead in combat. At first, she simply stood frozen, like a statue, while the world around her continued to turn with merciless indifference. The pain wasn't a feeling. It was an absence, as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. But of course, Elizabeth was a lady of English high society, and in high society, even grief had its limits. She cried, of course, locked away in her room during the hours when no one could see her. But the moment she emerged from her chambers, she was the honored widow, the one expected to exhibit dignity, because after all, no one wants to see tears, my dear, as her mother had said while adjusting the black veil over her hair. The pressure to move on came faster than she had ever imagined. Mourning, to society, was like an uncomfortable dress to be worn for a few weeks before being shoved back into the wardrobe. And if you were a young widow, all the more so. Elizabeth, without the support of a husband or the usefulness of children, soon became a problem to be solved. The words of comfort from aunts and neighbors were replaced with pitiful glances and whispered comments about her delicate position. After all, what could a young, childless woman do to survive? Even a lady couldn't escape scandal if she mourned for too long. Elizabeth, her heart shattered, found herself forced to consider what everyone around her insisted she must do: marry again. If Thomas was no longer there to protect her from the sharp claws of whispers and expectations, she would have to find someone who could. But how could she even think of another man? How could she look into someone's face and even for a moment imagine replacing Thomas's smile, his laughter, the very essence of home for her? Yet, when Mr. Edmund Hawthorne, a distinguished nobleman known for his kindness and considerable fortune, proposed, the pressure became unbearable. Her family rejoiced, her aunts breathed sighs of relief, and even society silently applauded her wisdom. Elizabeth didn't stand a chance against what seemed like destiny. With Edmund's sweet, reassuring promises of safety and stability, Elizabeth heard her own voice accepting a future she had never envisioned. Marriage to Edmund solved many problems. He was kind, upright, and undoubtedly capable of providing her with a respectable, comfortable life. He promised protection and an end to the rumors, and Elizabeth knew she was accepting what seemed to be the only solution. But accepting also meant burying the love she still felt for Thomas, or at least trying to. As she agreed to take this new step, part of her wondered if she could truly move forward, if she could ever free herself from her feelings, or if, deep down, Thomas would always remain in an untouchable corner of her heart. Grief was officially in the past. The future was Edmund. The wedding to Edmund took place quietly, with minimal ceremony and no fanfare. There was no need for a grand celebration after all. The ladies of society whispered approvingly, and with a hint of envy, about how Elizabeth had, as they said, secured her position. Edmund was a man of impeccable reputation, a true pillar of the nobility. He made no grand promises, but offered Elizabeth something no one else seemed willing to give her: a safe space to be herself, with all her pain, all her scars, and strangely enough, all the ghosts that haunted her heart. Edmund was patient in a way Elizabeth found disconcerting. He knew he wasn't the love of her life, and he seemed fine with that. When nights were long and shadows felt particularly heavy, he would accompany her to the garden, where they walked in silence, merely listening to the sound of leaves beneath their feet. He didn't pry or demand feelings he knew she couldn't yet give. It was as though he understood that Elizabeth's heart, like his own, had been shaped by losses and grief that time had not yet healed. Elizabeth began to rebuild a routine, a new life, and a sense of stability slowly took root. Edmund wasn't a passionate man, but he was a kind friend, and to her surprise, an excellent listener. He soothed her with simple words and small gestures, a cup of tea placed by her side on gray mornings, a book left by her favorite chair, wildflowers he knew she loved. These small kindnesses, so natural for Edmund, offered her a quiet solace she had never imagined finding with someone who, until recently, was a complete stranger. And yet, the ghost of Thomas lingered, invisible and persistent. There were moments when, walking through the halls of her new home or gazing out the window at sunset, Elizabeth felt a sharp pang in her chest, a furtive guilt, as if she were betraying a silent promise she had made to Thomas when she bid him farewell in her heart. She wondered if Edmund's face would ever fill the void Thomas had left, or if he would always remain in some distant place, shrouded in the mist of an incomplete love. In silence, Elizabeth accepted Edmund's presence and the peace he offered, but she continued to question herself. Could a heart marked by a lost love ever fully yield to the new? For Elizabeth, it was just another tea at the Rutherford estate, an afternoon drenched in dull conversations about flowers, dresses, and balls. She forced herself to smile, replying politely and nodding automatically. Edmund was absent, busy with social obligations, so she resigned herself to fulfilling her role as the devoted wife alone. Then, she heard the whisper, a conversation between two ladies beside her, their voices so loud in their excitement that any secret was an invitation to an audience. "Yes, my dear, a soldier, presumed dead. Imagine the shock," one of them whispered, her tone brimming with theatrical drama. "He returned, just like that. Poor family didn't know how to react." Elizabeth froze. Her heart leapt painfully, as if yanked by an invisible string, and suddenly the room felt far too small, the air too thin. A wave of adrenaline coursed through her, her hands clutching the fabric of her skirt. "It can't be," she thought, desperate to push away the growing thought in her mind, but powerless to stop it. Thomas? No. Impossible. Reality couldn't be so cruel. But the doubt planted itself in her heart like a seed, growing and taking root with every whispered word that reached her ears, every look of sympathy she intercepted from the other ladies. In the days that followed, Elizabeth forced herself to continue her routine, but everything felt off, as though she were living in a poorly acted play. Edmund's calm gaze, the lukewarm conversations, the quiet walks that once brought her some peace. Now, all of it unsettled her, as if her life had become a farce teetering on collapse. She walked the streets with feverish attention, her eyes searching, her heart dreading what she might find. Every step she took, every street she crossed was a mixture of hope and terror. Hope to see Thomas, and terror that he was truly there, that everything she had tried to move past would unravel in an instant. And then it happened. On a sunny afternoon, returning from the market, she saw him. Thomas stood right outside her home, his expression grave yet so achingly familiar, the look in his eyes the same that had made her fall in love years ago. He looked older, more worn, but it was undoubtedly him, flesh and blood, as though he had never left, as though every moment of suffering, every tear she had shed, had been a cruel joke played by fate. Elizabeth stopped, unable to move, unable to breathe. Everything around her vanished, the passers-by, the carriages, even the wind. She felt like a puppet whose strings had been suddenly cut. A wave of relief and desperate happiness washed over her. Thomas was alive. The sleepless nights, the forced mourning, the void she had tried to fill with Edmund, all of it seemed momentarily insignificant. But as the seconds passed, joy began to fade, replaced by a slow, crushing dread. Because, of course, this wasn't a happy reunion. This wasn't a romantic scene where lovers ran into each other's arms, like the cheap novels her sister hid under the bed. This was a tragedy. She was now the wife of another man, a good, kind, and devoted man. Edmund didn't deserve to be betrayed, and Thomas didn't deserve to be the ghost haunting the life she was desperately trying to rebuild. But how could she ignore him? How could she simply turn her back on the love that had once been the center of her world? Thomas looked at her with a mix of joy and pain, a look that said everything they couldn't say. And in that moment, Elizabeth realized that fate had trapped her in a snare from which there was no graceful escape. If she ran to Thomas's arms, she would betray the trust and security Edmund had given her, risking the ruin of all three of them. But if she turned away, Pretending this reunion had never happened, she would shatter the heart of the man who, in some way, still inhabited her own. Time seemed to stand still, each second stretching like a taut thread on the verge of snapping. They stood there, motionless, trapped in a universe where words had no place. All Elizabeth wanted to do was run, flee from a destiny mocking her with such cruelty. Yet at the same time, all she wanted was to remain there, gazing at Thomas, telling him with her eyes what circumstances forbade them to speak, that she had never forgotten him and never would. At last, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. The decision she made in that moment would define the course of their lives. Thomas could hardly believe what he was hearing. There was Elizabeth, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling as she tried to explain the absurd reason that had driven her to accept another man. With every word she spoke, it felt as though an icy chain was wrapping tighter around his chest. "They told me you were dead," she whispered, as if those words could somehow soften the growing chasm of pain between them, filling every unspoken space. Elizabeth kept repeating herself, justifying her choice with the army's letter, the weight of her grief, the relentless insistence of her family. And Thomas stood there, still and unmoving, fighting the urge to react, to shout that she should never have given up on him. "You really believed them?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. He didn't want to sound cruel, but the words came out laced with the bitterness of someone whose most vulnerable place had just been struck. The truth was, Thomas didn't know what he wanted to hear. Part of him longed for Elizabeth to confess that she had never loved Edmund, that it had all been a great lie forced upon her by society. But another part, a more realistic part, understood that the world had kept turning in his absence, that the people he loved had moved on. And that understanding was like poison, spreading slowly, corroding everything in its path. Thomas took a deep breath and let her finish. Elizabeth spoke of the loneliness, of how the silence in the house had become unbearable after the news. She described how everyone around her had urged her to move on, to get over the grief, to secure her place in society. Day after day, the same voices had insisted, and she, exhausted and without the strength to fight, had given in. She looked at him with swollen eyes, almost pleading for him to understand that her choice wasn't born of a lack of love, but out of necessity, out of pressure. With each word, Thomas felt a pang of understanding, a glimpse of compassion he tried with all his might to suppress. But he also felt something else, a treacherous resentment, growing slowly despite his will. After all, while she had been pressured into accepting a new husband, he had spent months on the battlefield, holding on to the hope of returning to her arms, the distant light that guided him through his darkest moments. He had believed that his home still awaited him, that his love remained the anchor that would keep him steady. And now, to find that all his effort, all those days of pain and struggle, had ended with a reality in which he was an intruder. The betrayal burned like fire. And yet, despite all the hurt, Thomas knew he couldn't entirely blame her. Yes, the pain was immense. Yes, the weight of her revelation was like a boulder crushing his chest. But he could see how much it had hurt her too, how desperately she was trying to be fair to him, even though fairness was impossible at that moment. There was a shadow of resignation in Elizabeth's eyes, a sadness he recognized, as if he and she were mirrors of one another, both carrying the scars of what they had lost. By the end of their conversation, both were silent, the echo of their words filling the space between them. Thomas resolved that, no matter how cruel fate had been, he couldn't simply turn his back on Elizabeth and disappear. She was the love of his life. There was no changing that, no matter how impossible their situation had become. And so, he made a decision. He would stay nearby, from a distance, perhaps as a friend, or at least as a silent shadow that would protect her. However, daily proximity to Elizabeth and Edmund soon became an unbearable burden. Each encounter, every silent glance they shared, felt as though the love that still lingered between them was trapped, confined to a secret, painful existence, never to be exposed to the light of day. Thomas saw it in Elizabeth's gestures, in her unspoken words, that she still loved him too. But there was a barrier between them, an invisible yet insurmountable obstacle, the new bond she had formed with Edmund. The days dragged on like a punishment, each one heavier than the last. And while Thomas tried with all his strength to maintain the composure of an honorable gentleman, he felt increasingly torn between the desire to remain close to her and the need to distance himself to preserve both their dignity. The pain of loving without being able to touch, of longing without being able to declare it, was a silent torment, a slow fire that burned without ever fully consuming him. And so, Thomas found himself trapped in a love he could no longer live but could never abandon. Elizabeth felt a wave of dizziness as the doctor's words settled over her. Pregnant. For a moment, the world around her seemed to spin, her thoughts colliding in a whirlwind of shock and conflicting emotions. In other circumstances, it would have been a reason for immense joy. But in that moment, all she felt was a desperate confusion, a tightening in her chest that seemed endless. She stared at her reflection in the mirror of the doctor's office, her pale face, her wide eyes, as though she were looking at a stranger. The child growing within her, the product of her marriage to Edmund, represented a new beginning, and at the same time, a definitive end to the love she still harbored for Thomas. Elizabeth forced herself to smile as she shared the news with Edmund, and he, of course, received it with genuine, calm happiness. It was as though this pregnancy confirmed that their marriage was finally solidified, that their bond had deepened into something unbreakable. For a time, Elizabeth tried to convince herself that this new life could somehow fill the void she still felt in her heart. After all, Edmund was a good man, devoted and kind. Together, they could build a family, raising a child surrounded by love and stability. But every time Elizabeth's hand rested on her belly, every time she thought of the child growing within her, she felt a stab of pain. This child was a final goodbye to the dreams she'd once held with Thomas, an irrevocable seal binding her to a life in which he could never be a part. Against her will, she found herself imagining what it would have been like if this baby were his, if Thomas were the father, if they'd had the chance to create a family together. It was a thought that brought a mixture of bitterness and guilt, and Elizabeth despised herself for it, for being unable to give herself fully to what should have been pure, unshadowed joy. Thomas heard the news by chance, through the inevitable whispers of society. The moment he did, it felt as though the ground had crumbled beneath his feet. Elizabeth was expecting a child, Edmund's child. He tried to steady himself against the ache tightening in his chest, but the truth was crushing. While he had quietly held onto the hope that somehow fate might show mercy and allow them to find a way to be together, he now understood that the dream was over. There was no place for him in that future, not with a child on the way, a child that would bind Elizabeth and Edmund together forever. Thomas made a decision. He knew he couldn't abandon her, that he couldn't bear the thought of her facing this moment alone, even with Edmund by her side. With a mix of pain and resolve, Thomas decided to care for Elizabeth in secret. Quietly, he began to ensure that she received the best care, the finest doctors, and everything necessary for her comfort and well-being, all without Edmund ever knowing of his constant presence behind the scenes. To achieve this, he enlisted the help of a loyal maid and a trusted doctor who, without asking questions, were willing to aid his acts of protection and care. Small packages of herbs to soothe her nausea, medical advice delivered as casual suggestions, even minor comforts, a soft blanket, a special pillow to support her through sleepless nights. Everything was done in secret, all to ensure Elizabeth felt supported, even if she never knew the source of the help. But every act of care deepened Thomas's pain. With each new detail he arranged, he felt the weight of his own helplessness, being so close to her yet utterly unreachable. He knew he could never stand by Elizabeth's side as a father, could never hold her child in his arms or hear the laughter of that little one playing by their side. The proximity was torture, but the thought of leaving her was simply unbearable. He had made his choice, to love Elizabeth silently, to protect her happiness and well-being, even at the cost of his own peace. As the days passed, Thomas found himself trapped in a cycle of pain and devotion, of love and renunciation. Each small kindness he extended to Elizabeth was a reminder of the life he could never have with her. And yet, it was the only way he knew to remain close to her. The newborn's cries filled the room. a sound both delicate and powerful, as if life itself were making a triumphant announcement. Elizabeth, exhausted and overcome with emotion, gazed at her daughter's tiny face and felt an overwhelming wave of love that made it difficult to breathe. The baby was perfect, with her tiny fingers and a serene expression that brought a smile to Elizabeth's tear-streaked face. Edmund, standing beside her, held her hand firmly, his eyes shining with pride and joy. It was a moment of pure happiness, but Elizabeth knew, in the deepest, most secret corner of her heart, that it was also the end of an era. As if by reflex, when she looked at her daughter's face, her mind betrayed her and brought her memories of Thomas. This was the moment when all her dreams of him dissolved, every unspoken promise, every plan for a future together. The child in her arms was the bond that permanently tied her to Edmund, a tether that was definitive and inescapable. Elizabeth understood that there would be no turning back. Her daughter symbolized an irrevocable choice. There was love in this moment, of course, but also a quiet and profound sadness, a whispered farewell to a love that would never fade, even if it had to be buried in silence. When Thomas heard of the birth, he went to see her one last time, not in the room, not at her side, but from a distance. Standing in the hallway, he caught a glimpse of Elizabeth through the crack of the slightly open door, laughing softly with her baby in her arms and Edmund by her side. They were a family now, a complete unit he could never be part of. Still, their eyes met briefly, a moment of connection filled with unsaid words, repressed feelings, and all that had been and all that could never be. It was a glance that held love, pain, and the quiet acceptance that this was their final goodbye. Thomas knew it was time to leave. Elizabeth deserved the chance to be happy, to raise her daughter free from the shadow of a love that no longer had a place in her life. He accepted his fate with resignation, a decision that hurt deeply but was unavoidable. After all, he understood that true love sometimes meant knowing when to let go, when to step aside and allow the person you love to build a life you could never give them. Even as he withdrew from her life, Thomas couldn't abandon the love that still beat within his chest. He knew he would need to find a way to honor what they had shared, to leave a silent mark that would remind them both of the love they had lived, even if no one else ever knew. And so he left, carrying with him the memories and dreams that would never be fulfilled, but determined to transform the love that remained into something Elizabeth could feel, even from afar, like a constant and invisible presence. The social season was in full swing, and the Pembroke mansion glittered with the elegance of the region's most prominent families. Elizabeth had returned to attending events, as was expected of a married and well-established lady. She moved through the room with a polished smile and the impeccable posture of a woman whose life, at least outwardly, seemed complete. Edmund stood beside her, exchanging polite greetings and offering kind remarks, while Elizabeth, a master of concealing her emotions, feigned interest in mundane conversations. It was a night like any other until a familiar figure emerged from the crowd, and all the sounds around her seemed to fade into a distant murmur. Thomas was there, only steps away, still carrying that same aura of quiet confidence and gravity that had always affected her so deeply. Yet there was something different about him now, a calm resoluteness, as though he had finally made peace with his ghosts. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken, as it always did when their eyes met, a discreet flame that could never be extinguished. He approached with the firm stride of a man who had nothing left to lose, and somehow she knew that this meeting would change everything. They moved discreetly away from the crowd, stepping onto a balcony where they could remain free from prying eyes. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon, before finally turning to her with a faint smile. "There's something I'd like to tell you, Elizabeth," he began, his voice low but steady. "After I left the city, I needed to find a way to move forward. I knew. I needed to turn what I felt into something good, something that could, in some way, honor what we shared." Elizabeth studied him, her expression a mix of curiosity and sadness. "And did you find that way?" she asked softly, unsure if she was ready to hear the answer. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a tenderness that nearly brought her to tears. "We founded an orphanage, some friends and I. a home for girls who lost their families or were abandoned to fend for themselves. A place where they can be cared for, educated, and hopefully loved, he explained, his words simple yet profound. It's the kind of home I always dreamed of building with you, Elizabeth. A home we both envisioned once. It wasn't possible for us, but I found a way to make it real, in a different way. Elizabeth felt a wave of emotion overtake her, a mixture of quiet sorrow and unexpected joy. The love they had shared, though torn from them so cruelly, had endured. Not in the usual ways, not in fulfilled promises or shared futures, but in the lives of the children who now had a place to call home, in each life transformed by his generosity. What they had wasn't lost. It had been reborn in a way she could never have imagined. She looked at Thomas, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks as he briefly and respectfully held her hand, as if their farewell were a kind of blessing. "You've done something wonderful, Thomas. Something that makes me feel like, in some way, we're still connected, even though we're apart." She smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't known in years, as if she could finally accept the path their lives had taken. The orphanage was proof that their love had not been in vain, that even impossible loves could give rise to something beautiful and enduring. They both knew that their love, while eternal in essence, now belonged to the past. It was a memory, a sweet recollection that would live not between them, but in the lives of the children Thomas had taken in. There, on the mansion's balcony, surrounded by the distant hum of the party, they exchanged one final look of silent understanding. It wasn't a bitter goodbye, but one filled with acceptance, resignation, and gratitude. Elizabeth returned to the ballroom, knowing that this chapter of her life was finally closed. She would carry her love for Thomas in her heart, but her life was now with Edmund and her daughter. The legacy she and Thomas had left behind, in some form, would live on forever, a testament to how true love finds ways to endure, even if only in the quiet acts of kindness that touch lives, never knowing the story behind them. Thomas watched Elizabeth walk away, and with one last glance at the starlit sky, he turned to leave, feeling whole for the first time, as if he could finally leave the past behind. Epilogue: Memories and Resignation. On a quiet morning, wrapped in the typical spring mist of the English countryside, Elizabeth walked through the gardens of the orphanage, the hood of her cloak pulled low over her face. Few knew of her visits, and she preferred it that way. She liked to watch the girls running and playing in the courtyard, their laughter filling the air with a simple, spontaneous joy. There was something in their faces, a purity of innocence and a brightness of hope, that made her smile, though it also carried a twinge of melancholy. These children, in a way, were part of her and Thomas, a silent testimony to a love that had endured invisibly but unshakably. Elizabeth now lived alongside Edmund and their daughter, a life that was good, calm, and secure. Edmund was a devoted husband, and their daughter, a constant source of joy. She loved her family sincerely and cared for them with all the dedication she possessed. Yet deep within, she carried a quiet flame, a memory of Thomas that would never extinguish, like a sad song echoing softly in the depths of her heart. He was a part of her past that could never be forgotten, but she had learned to accept him as an indelible part of who she was. She had resigned herself to living with this quiet longing, understanding that true love doesn't always culminate in a happy ending. Sometimes it transforms into something greater, more enduring. In the orphanage, in the laughter and hopes of the girls who had found a home there, she felt that her love for Thomas lived on. And every time she left, she carried with her a soft peace, a sense that even in absence, love continued to bloom. Thomas and Elizabeth went their separate ways, but proved that true love can survive in unexpected forms, even in the shadows. Tell me, what would you have done in Elizabeth's place? Would you have made the same decision? Comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to write "Love Leaves Marks" in the comments. I started the channel Romances that touch the heart because, honestly, I'm tired of stories that only leave us feeling down. Here, you'll only find lighthearted romances full of love and heartwarming endings. I've always believed these stories make life a little easier, and I know you deserve that too. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single video, and leave a like to help spread more love. And if you enjoy passionate twists and turns, I have an unmissable story for you to watch right now. The Duke's scandal. He wanted to turn the maid into his mistress, but the son fell in love. Can you imagine the chaos? A father and son fighting over a young maid, and a secret that could destroy everyone's reputation. Click to find out how this story ends. It's even more intense and full of forbidden love. See you in the next video!